Hi, it's Jim Lindeman again. We finally reached to the 10th topic, and now this is the last one. Hopefully you have been able to bear with me up to this point, and if not, you're not listening to this anyway. So, okay, human, evolutionary prejudice. So you have the father who is sitting there on the computer, and he's gradually getting worse and worse and worse, and finally he says, Jeremy, help, and Jeremy comes along and just hit restart, Dad. It's weird, you can almost watch parents devolving. I shudder to think what will happen to them when we go away to college. How much the idea of evolution and all of this has become so commonplace in our thought processes of our culture. And then you have the priest, or priest. He comes and sees Andy fighting. He says, Andy, and then he says, forget it, mate. If only he had a better nature he could appeal to, or I could appeal to. Here again, you have that sense: is that what's the nature? The nature is the beast. The nature is the gorilla, or whatever, or the orangutan, or whatever it may be, that you want a chimpanzee as the forerunner, and so we're just beasts at heart anyway. All right, just to kind of give you some thoughts here, here's Neanderthal man. Here's another picture of Neanderthal man. And here is a little bit nicer picture, but still kind of a dumb look on his face. And then you have a naked group, and they're basically eating without fire because they haven't discovered fire yet, because they're not advanced enough. What do you notice about how the Neanderthal is depicted? Very ape-like, naked. Ernest Haeckel wanted Homo stupidus, or even stranger, Homo sapiens stupidus, as stupid wise man, as the name for the Neanderthal man. Fortunately, he was outvoted. Why? Because theory determines data. He had to demonstrate that this was indeed a subhuman, and all the artistry that's being depicted here is to guarantee to you how the Neanderthal man was just a cross between ape and man. Here the artist consults the anthropologists. The result is the opinion that the earliest hominids were more ape-like, while later forms were more human. Much the same informed conjecture influences the shapes of the lips, ears, and the degree and distribution of hairiness. Through the visual appearance of the reconstructions has changed drastically, it is not due to the scientific evidence itself. Instead, it's due to the way evolutionists fit them into their evolutionary model. All too often, conventional stereotypes supply the image. The article explains that though the artist has done a painstaking job in doing this reconstruction, the process of creating a reconstruction is considerably speculative. The artist and anthropologist working together can drastically change the appearance of the reconstruction to suit their presuppositions. And so you have this 1873, 1909, 1929, 1952. And there you have the depiction of the humanoids, of which the Neanderthal female is here, but looking very, very much like she belongs among the apes. That's what has happened now. Here you have the current idea of what a Neanderthal must have looked like. Funny thing is that the skull hasn't changed. Nothing has changed in terms of the scientific evidence. But what you have now are far more human-looking people, basically. Of course, I had a little bit of fun with this in the next picture. Here you have Neanderthal man, and you have Chuck Norris, and I looked at him and I thought, boy, how close he looks to being Chuck. So you make your own conclusions as about him. That was just a matter of just to have a little bit of fun with one of the pictures. Put a suit on him. And does the Neanderthal man really look that much different? You see, this is a problem so often with talking about human and early man and so forth, is that there is a stake that the archaeologists and the scientists have to try and force evolution to be a reality. And they will do anything they can to make it be something of fact. The problem with the Neanderthal man is that we have discovered that he is far too close to being a human, to be that cross between ape and human. Put some clothes on him and see what happens. Now you have again the appearance of the Cro-magnon man. And so here again you've got Neanderthal man being very much depicted as partial ape, and then you have the Cro-magnon as getting closer to modern man. Interestingly enough, he's not very tall compared to the modern man. However, what has been determined is that the Cro-magnon not only had a larger head or brain, he also was according to the modern day men, he was above the tall range, that he was over 6 foot. And of course, again, you have the Neanderthal being depicted as pretty much stupid, pretty much, not able to be able to, not so much of a human, except that what he did is he shaved his head. And again, you have, this is a Cro-magnon. Again, put some clothes on him. What do you see? Poor guy, maybe someday they'll find a cure for Cro-magnonism. So, you have the Boskop skull. And this is a reconstruction done in 1918 of what the skull must have been like. Shaded areas depict recovered bones. So really, basically, the only bone that they've got is this little bit here and then part of the jawbone. Houghton, at a 1915 meeting of the Royal Society of South Africa, reported the cranial capacity must have been very large, and by calculation of the Broca method, a minimum figure of 1832 cc's, cubic centimeters. Scottish scientist Robert Broom, the corrected cranial capacity of the Boskop skull is 1980 cc's, with an increase of the prefrontal cortex of a staggering 53%. In other words, the area that does the decisions and the understandings and all of that, that was massive. Naturalist Lauren Isley said, "It's all happened already. Back there in the past, 10,000 years ago, the man of the future with the big brain and small teeth. He lived in Africa. His brain was bigger than your brain. His face was straight and small, almost a child's face." Fitzsimmons' site had been a communal living center, with many collected rocks, leftover bones, some casually interred skeletons of normal-looking humans. To one side of the site was a clearing, was a single, carefully constructed tomb built for a single occupant, perhaps the tomb of a leader or of a revered wise man. His remains had been positioned to face the rising sun. In repose, he appeared unremarkable in every regard except for a giant skull. Human intelligence and modern arrogance. What distinguishes man from the rest of the primate world and makes him unique is his brain size, more than 3 times greater than that of the gorilla. His tool-making ability, one of the great hallmarks of man, and his complex language. There is no such thing as a primitive language anywhere on Earth. So the larger brain case is indicative of the fact that man is smarter than the apes, because he has a brain that's 3 times the size. Modern assumption, the farther back in time, the stupider humanoids get. Therefore, we are the smartest and wisest. So you have an interesting contrast between kind of an assumption that goes on and another assumption that seems to be in the background. John Klotz wrote this: "This is an arrogant age in which we live. We have come to believe that all those who lived prior to the 20th century were savages. To claim that they were incapable of careful scientific studies is to be arrogant. Indeed, it is to play the part of the arrogant fool. All right, let's take a look at this. Wow, look at the difference in brains here. The brain case size of the Neanderthal was around 1450 cc's. Cro-magnon, which is what this brain is supposed to represent, 30 to 10,000 years ago was 1750 to 1550. The Boskop skull we just talked about, and the same time period, was anywhere between 1980 to 1650. Modern man is 1350 to 750. Now again, you have the sense of what makes the difference is the fact that we have this big brain. Well, when you have something that's that massive, a brain, well, of course, what happens to that? Now the smaller brain means a more efficient brain. In other words, scientists are saying, oh, the thing is that why the modern man has a smaller brain is because the brain is more efficient than what the Boskop or the Cro-magnon or the Neanderthal had. Why? Because if you're going to have evolution, you've got to have some improvement, not an apparent de-evolution of the brain. The thing is that, okay, you want to say that this is because the modern man has a more efficient brain. Wonderful. How do you prove that? How do you have a brain that actually exists? How do you have somebody that actually exists from this time period so that you can actually test? It's wonderful to be able to make such pronouncements irresponsibly, scientifically irresponsibly. What was the scientific proof on this? Is this merely a cover to protect evolution? That entropy couldn't be diminishing brain capacity, could it? Slow aging. So you have the Neanderthal child here and here, and a young boy that's there, old man with probably his son. This is a modern man, and it's very interesting how you have such similarity there. Dr. John Coso, orthodontist, took x-rays of Neanderthal skulls, determining that the maturing rate of children was much slower. They had better teeth and bones and a larger brain. Through anatomical studies and a series of standardized radiographs, similar to the ones utilized by orthodontists across the world, I calculate that the Neanderthal lifespan in southwestern France to be between 250 to 300 years. That the brain and the face and the jaw all change as a person, throughout a person's lifetime. And if the same rate of change is occurring, perhaps even slower with the Neanderthal, then from this to this would indicate a span of about 250, 300 years. Interestingly enough, now you're getting into the ballpark of what the Bible says. But of course, the Bible can't be correct. Japanese, European anthropologists. Neanderthal brain size at birth was similar to that of the recent Homo sapiens. The growth rate of the Neanderthal baby skulls was as slow as, or slower than, those of modern human babies. It is likely that Neanderthal life history was similarly slow or even slower paced than in recent Homo sapiens. So you have the biblical pre-flood late maturity. You had face bones change throughout the life. During this time you have sperm mutation rates, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, increase with the male's age. That you can have some fairly major genetic differences when children father dynasties. All right, let's go on a little bit. Genetic diversity. Twins born in April 2005 in Nottingham, UK, blue-eyed Remy might be called white, Her brown-eyed sister, Cain, is black. Both parents have white mothers and black fathers. And yet, twins were born to this couple, one apparently white, the other apparently, if you will, black. A baby inherits, so in other words, what you have here is kind of what Mendel identified when he was working with peas. And he's talking about the genetics of inheritance, or the inheritance of genetics. A baby inherits 60 to 130 new mutations from the parents. This number increases if the father is older. At 400 years old, he could pass perhaps 10,000 mutations on to a child. In other words, the mutations that come right from when the person, like male or female, is that single egg in the mother's womb, to the point when they reach maturity and to the point in which they are now bearing children. That all that time and all the different cell replications that have to happen throughout that time span, that these mutations begin to build up. And so you can have some drastic changes occurring even within a family genome. So here you've got the idea of genetics and the fact that a lot of the characteristics that are so talked about as races are basically a matter of simple genetics. If Adam and Eve were of middle brown complexion as a mixture of light and dark genetic information, similar to Remy and Cain's parents, all shades from the darkest through to the lightest would be accounted for in their offspring. Therefore, even more so with Noah and his sons and their wives. You want to talk about more genetic information that has come about during the time span between Adam and Eve and Noah, and the fact that now this is being bared or carried, born by Noah and his sons, and then also by the mother and the three wives of the sons. You're talking about a wide range of possibilities that just simply come because of mere genetic differences, not different species or different races. Scientific tests showed no difference between any human races mentally and only minor physical differences. Can be more difference between two people of the same race than between two people of different races. The basic genetic differences typically go around 0.2%. The concept of races should be abandoned, instead to talk more about people groups rather than to start really isolating as if races were something completely different evolutionary step. Racial characteristics, skin color, eye shape, etc. account for only 0.012% of human biological variation. Absolutely trivial. Okay, this is what we need to know in the background, but unfortunately with evolution and the way that Darwinism was being pushed and used, we find out other things. Third, the authors tested for evolutionary relationships, any similarities due to common ancestry among apes, Neanderthals, and various groups of modern humans. This is where the real controversy lies. They discovered that Neanderthals were well within the range of diversity of modern man, and two, that Neanderthal genome is incredibly similar to the genome of modern man, and three, that there are only a few fixed differences between modern man and Neanderthals. But even those few fixed differences could vanish as we learn more about modern human and ancient Neanderthal genetic diversity. The more we study, the more variation we find, and so the fixed differences tend to be reduced over time. Neanderthals overlapped modern humans for up to 5,400 years, according to evolutionary picture. So if you're going to have this much, and they intermarried, and you do have Neanderthal genes in, especially those from Europe, A lot of this whole concept of trying to push, for instance, Neanderthal as a step or as an offshoot from Homo sapiens really does not work well. The grand experiment. Now we get to see Darwinism in its most lethal form. The idea that the hereditary quality of the race can be improved by selective breeding is as old as Plato's Republic. But modern eugenics thought arose only in the 19th century. The emergence of interest in eugenics during that century had multiple roots. The most important was the theory of evolution. For Francis Galton's ideas on eugenics, and it was he who created the term eugenics, were a direct logical outgrowth of the scientific doctrine elaborated by his cousin Charles Darwin. So you have the eugenics, and this was one of the conferences. Wolfgang Paulus in 1946 textbook, The World of Life displays Philippine women as lower life forms with large brow ridges and sloping foreheads. This is the result of what happens when evolution rules the roost. And then you have Ella Smith textbook, Exploring Biology, displays primitive and more highly evolved races. So you've got the Aryan, and you've got the Native American, and then you've got the Negroid, and I'm not quite sure, I think that's Philippine, or something. The Scopes trial, everybody knows about the Scopes trial, probably does, and how evolution won. Well, the thing is that one of the things that you don't know about is the textbook that Scopes was using for evolution, A Civic Biology by George Hunter, and its lab book were blatantly eugenic and offensively racist. Humanity was divided into 5 races, each ranked on the evolutionary scale, from the Ethiopian or Negro type to the highest type of all, the Caucasian. Crime and immorality ran in families which are parasitic on society. They were lower animals, and we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. We do have the remedy of separating the sexes in various ways, preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. This is the book that Darwinists of the day insisted that Scopes had a right to teach. The egalitarian idea that all people are created equal, which now dominates Western ideology, has not been universal among nations and cultures. A major force against this view was the social Darwinism eugenics movement, especially its crude survival of the fittest worldview. So the whole idea of the Constitution, all men are created equal, or of the Declaration of Independence, according to evolution, is not true. Improving the human race involved not just increasing the birth rate of the fit by selected parenthood, positive eugenics, but also reducing the birth rate of those people thought to impair such improvement, the unfit. And we will see how that was used. The whole idea of now taking the whole process of evolution and of selection and used to destroy people. The grand experiment, the final solution. Hitler's Nazi Party's major goal was to apply this accepted science to society. The core idea of Darwinism was not evolution, but selection. Evolution describes the results of selection. Hitler stressed that to produce a better society, we, the Nazis, must understand and cooperate with science, and thus to significantly improve humankind. Nazi governmental policy was openly influenced by Darwinism, the zeitgeist of both science and educated society of the time. This can be evaluated by an examination of extant documents, writings, and artifacts produced by the Nazi movement and its many scientist supporters. Aryan evolution superiority gave not only the right but the duty to subjugate all other peoples because it was founded on science. Darwinism was incorporated into their political system with nothing left out, replete with words like space, struggle, selection, extinction. The world is a jungle in which different nations struggle for space. The stronger win, the weaker die out or killed. Thus developed the doctrine of Germany's inherent right to rule the world on the basis of superior strength of the hammer and anvil relationship between the right and the weaker nations. The cost. Humans were animals to whom the genetics laws learned from livestock breeding could be applied. But instead of natural forces and chance, the process must be directed to advance the human race. First was to isolate inferior races to prevent further contaminating of the Aryan gene pool. Public support was from the belief, common in the educated classes, that certain races were genetically inferior as scientifically proven by Darwinists. They simply applied science-proven facts to produce a superior race for a better world. The business of the corporate state was eugenics or artificial selection, politics as applied biology. And so you have those at the train station are being determined who lives, who dies. Life with a gas chamber decision. Those who died often were just marched right off to the gas chambers and disposed of. Women at Birkenau, some were subjected to heinous experiments, trying to figure out, well, how does this work? But it didn't matter, because this was a lower life form. And therefore it didn't matter that you did terrible things, because wouldn't you do terrible things to mice? Wouldn't you do terrible things to other kinds of animals in the search for knowledge, in the search for a better world? This is Darwinism, as it is applied. And there is nothing in Darwinism or evolution that would reject what is being happening here. 1933 is compulsory sterilization of undesirables to prevent contamination of the superior race gave way in 1938 to genocide of over 11 million considered subhuman or unworthy of life, authenticated and documented by the Nuremberg trials, including Jews, evangelical Christians, blacks, gypsies, communists, homosexuals, amputees, and mental patients. Darwin's basic theory also clearly contributed to the death of about 40 million other humans in the war. In other words, to make Darwinism work, they had to go to war. They had to subject and subjugate all the other countries so that they can impose their will of the hammer and anvil concept. The primary reason that Nazism reached to the extent of the Holocaust was the widespread acceptance of social Darwinism by the scientific and academic community. So you want to tell me that all these scientists all had supported, because after all, they have the truth. Unfortunately, we have just seen what happens with that kind of truth. The grand experiment, Christian opposition. Ernest Haeckel, German's father of evolution. The church with its morality of love and charity is an effete fraud, a perversion of the natural order. Christianity makes no distinction of race or of color. It seeks to break down all racial barriers. In this respect, the hand of Christianity is against that of nature. For are not the races of mankind the evolutionary harvest which nature has toiled through long ages to produce? May we not say then that Christianity is anti-evolutionary in its aim? In a lecture titled On Evolution, Darwin's Theory, Haeckel argued that Darwin was correct. Humankind had unquestionably evolved from the animal kingdom, Humankind's social and political existence is governed by the laws of evolution, natural selection, and biology, as clearly shown by Darwin. To argue otherwise was backward superstition. And of course, it was organized religion which did this, and thus stood in the way of scientific and social progress. In Germany, when you have Martin Luther, who stood against the atrocities and some of the things that he saw happening in the church of that time. And on his Denkmal, which means think once, I will not die but live and declare the Lord's works. You have a number of people who stood up against what the Nazis were doing, against what the evolutionary theory kept saying ought to happen. You have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, Hans Meisser, Raoul Wallenberg, Kai Monk, Elvind Burgraff, and what was called the Confessing Church movement, where there were many pastors that bound together in order to try and raise a dissenting voice during this time. Some weren't aware so much about the Holocaust itself, but what they did see, they had to raise their voice against, and therefore their lives were threatened. The grand experiment. Oh, whoops. Wait. Okay. The eugenics campaign of the Nazis is a terrible chapter in German history. Thousands of persons living in nursing homes and medical centers, asylums, and other institutions were killed by the Germans through 1941. Roman Catholic bishops actively denounced the Nazi campaign, and it was halted after these Catholic clerics embarrassed the German government internationally. All during this murderous period, there was silence from Lutheran pulpits. Half of all the victims of this program were residents of Lutheran institutions whose employees participated in the killings. Stegman Gall tells us that not one public protest against euthanasia was ever launched by a Protestant churchman. Jansen asks why the Protestant clergy were so quiet in this and on the Holocaust, which was then underway throughout Europe. Why were the Lutheran pastors so absent in protest when so many of them were willing to engage in illegal activities to defend their freedom as part of the confessing church to worship God? Surely this is the blackest stain upon their record. The voice of most Christians was silent in the face of popular pressure. Will we repeat history? Is there not something happening now which threatens the lives of many? And will we just remain silent? Timelines. Evolutionary bias. As before, radiometric dating methods of dating depends on assumptions. As before, assumptions are made to conform to evolutionary thinking. As before, results are chosen based on evolutionary thinking. So in other words, again, my favorite is the world's oldest rock. 140 samples. Both of them, each sample was tested by two different methods. Only one of those two methods on one of those samples gave what was wanted, a 4.5 billion year age. 139.5 samples were discarded for the sake of that one half. Results are chosen based upon evolutionary thinking. Assumes an incremental development of mankind anatomically and culturally, an evolutionary framework as the overarching assumption. The acceptance of certain dating techniques for absolute values in dating human habitation. The scientific method can only work in the present, for it only has the artifacts in the present with which to experiment and investigate. Reasonable scientific conclusions can be reached about those artifacts in the framework in which we find them, whether these be tools or cities or fossils. However, as we extrapolate the observations into the past, we immediately step out of the scientific method and into the area of historical assumption. This is not science, but mere reasoned conclusions, however acceptable they may be to one's reasons. So, one of the things we have to understand is that when we're going to talk about science, science can only apply to what you have in hand. The moment you go beyond that, it now becomes philosophy. Oops. Okay. Evolutionary philosophical linearity. So you start out with the oldest, the farthest back, and you've got Paleolithic, lower, middle, upper, then you have Mesolithic, and then that goes from 10 to 8,000, I think, yeah. And Neolithic from 8 to 5,000. Then you got 4 different stages in Neolithic and everything else like this. And civilization, men have followed that progression. Or have they? Paleolithic, usually defined based on stone implements alone. Mesolithic, defined by stone implements and evidence of building, usually rock or clay. Both time cultures are defined as hunting-gathering cultures. Why? Because after all, you don't have the building that's supposed to be there. Neolithic, defined in terms of stone tools, bone tools, early pottery development, evidence of early farming communities, evidence of buildings and town structures. Chalcolithic, defined in terms of stone and metal tools, bone tools, other artifacts, pottery, town and village communities, and farming communities, but particularly the introduction of metal, mostly copper, used in weapons and other implements. The biblical framework provides a rival claim to the history of the ancient world. Historical framework of a legal claim which affects the hope of the world, the faith of nations, and the eternal well-being of the human race. The biblical framework comes and says, no, this is not valid. How do we know? Okay, humanity entered the scene fully developed and fully capable. A worldwide event divided humanity into 2 epochs, before the flood and after the flood. After the flood, all human genetic information was found in Noah, his sons, and their wives. Their genomes contained the first epoch's mutational changes, present animal and human population, and history shows the second epoch's accretion, which began about 2,300 years ago, or 2,300 BC. Although this family lived together at first, Babel marked a worldwide dispersal. Babel indicated, all right, let's try this again. Babel indicated competent construction ability, but at times stress. Well, all right, this is not working here. Let's try again one more. Stress alternate habitation was used, particularly caves. Caves were used for temporary shelter or to hide in. We have this in the Bible. On hot Coober Pedy, South Australia, in Malta homes are permanently in cool and fairly dry caves despite an era when there was major high-rise buildings. Okay, what's being said here is that in South Australia you have people living in caves. Deliberately so, built caves, so that they would not be exposed to the heat of the desert that's above them. In Malta, you have the same thing where people had built homes in caves because the caves were cooler in the times of heat. Some North American First Nations and Mongolian steppe tribes chose a nomadic life in tent-like structures. In other words, to apply the idea that they have to inevitably end up with cities and everything else like that. They weren't interested in doing that. And it wasn't as if therefore they were dumb and stupid and everything else like that, and they hadn't been advanced this far. It's just that they chose a lifestyle that was different than what is normally told them by evolutionary scientists. That they cannot have an advanced culture unless they have all these other things. And as one gets to know Native Americans and the kind of network that they had and the kind of cooperation between tribes and even in wartime, I would tend to doubt very strongly that that's a valid way of judging the ability of them to have their culture. People on the move don't bring unnecessary heavy baggage, and even hunting and other tools, when they know how to use material at hand. Why should they take heavy stuff with them if they don't need to? If they can make the tools and they can make the arrowheads and everything else like that, wherever they find themselves, why would they have to load themselves down with things that are literally not necessary? Time required to settle, establish themselves, maintain life, search for metal ores, build necessary equipment, possibly relearn the art of smelting. You know, yeah, you take a look at the history of mankind. If they had to, for instance, because of Babel, leave and go to a new area, you're talking about people who have to literally build their lives from scratch. A serial or parallel progress or recovery of culture. Wherever a culture is dated as Paleolithic, it is generally assumed to predate that which is called Mesolithic, which is in turn assumed to predate that which is Neolithic, which is then usually presumed to predate that which is Chalcolithic. Thus, the Mesolithic culture in the lowest level of Jericho would be assumed to predate the Chalcolithic culture of Eridu in Mesopotamia, despite the fact that the ancients regarded Eridu as the oldest city on earth. In other words, they're saying is that this predates everything that you've got. Even before the lowest levels of Jericho, you have a city that exists. So to be able to say that mankind was not advanced until finally you got past the different stages is invalid. Likely, Eridu is Babel. So after the confusion of speech, people spread out. Those who settled farther away would likely not have the same marks of sophisticated culture once enjoyed in the city. Until land is cleared and ready for crops, the society would be hunter-gatherer, living perhaps in caves. If they were inclined, like the North American Plains First Nations felt no desire to domesticate the buffalo, if they had enough leisure, they might go on to farm and herd animals. Apparently, the Plains Indians did not decide that they needed to have to go and do this. But cultural growth, development, or reclaiming of what they once had, what was cultural growth, development, or just reclaiming. In other words, they knew that this was possible, but could they do it now, or had they forgotten how to do some of these things? Diodorus Siculus, around 60 BC, people were living in caves along the Red Sea shores. Also barbarian tribes in Europe, some quite primitive during the Roman Empire era. And so you have people in caves, you've got barbarian tribes, and yet at the same time you have very, very highly refined and developed. Even Genghis Khan, the notorious barbarian, if I understand correctly, he was trained at the same school as one of the Caesars. It was not because he was ignorant, and it was not because he could not be refined. It was because of his choice. In Palestine, some lived in caves, while people lived in Jericho, dwelt in well-built, beautifully decorated houses. So consecutive or concurrent. An example. Consecutive means that they have to follow a certain pattern. Or concurrent means you have all kinds of living arrangements around you. The ancient Egyptian priest Manetho lists of Egyptian kings is being reconsidered. Originally thought to be a consecutive list, the realization is that there are two lists, one for the northern king, the other for the concurrent southern kings. This revises the dating benchmark for the history of the Near and Middle East, shortens the time span of the Egyptian civilization considerably. In other words, yes, you can have concurrent, different cultural levels, if you will. Is a caveman an ignorant, stupid half-ape ages before civilization arose? Does civilization depend on houses, certain kinds of tools, etc., as opposed to, say, for instance, the network of the North American First Nations alliances? The need to acknowledge concurrent streams of human culture that you need to be able to say is that no, you cannot define an age in the world based upon a certain segment of culture. We tend to overlook the fact that the 8 people who disembarked from the Ark had the task of surviving in an alien environment with no help from anyone else. Use it or lose it became the operative force. They would have had to focus on survival. They had to build new homes by hand, farm, husband herds and flocks, make clothes, etc., etc. Where was enough food to make it to the next stage? There would have to have been zero need to build arks, less time for the fine art and architecture, shipbuilding techniques, metallurgy, tool making. In short, all of the technology in the antediluvian world would have been virtually lost, except that which Noah and his sons personally knew and could do. Most technology would be lost in the struggle for survival in the new alien world. And at Babel, if there is divisions of labor, when the larger community is fragmented, then in the resulting groups would be disparities in their skills. The whole concept of evolution, and it has to follow a certain sequence, makes absolutely no accommodation to the fact that you have many, many valid reasons why people would be at a different stage of culture, not necessarily a different stage of mental capacity, but just simply that they are not there yet, and some chose not to get there. What prompted Solomon to observe? That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. Fascinating comment. Why would he say that? Cavemen and language. Okay, cavemen spoke in mere grunts. Primitives should be an earliest stage of language evolution, but only in movies. The hyoid bone for the larynx and the brain is organized for speech. There is no such thing as a primitive language. Even primitives have language far beyond their need. If this is evolution, then it should be that their language would match where they're at. But you don't. You have very complex, extremely complex, by the earliest civilizations, and they arrive full-blown. It is not as if you have, say for instance, in the records, a growing language. You have a language that is fully established. All we can observe about the history of languages shows a sort of linguistic entropy. All observation of the history of languages show them becoming simpler, not more complicated. We can list many examples. Classical Greek was more complicated than first century Greek, which is more complicated than modern Greek. Modern Romance languages like Spanish or French are much simpler than classical Latin. English and German are simpler than their ancestors. Chinese once had word endings like Latin. but now all Chinese words have only one syllable. My grandfather used to take pride in the fact that he could make one sentence last a whole page, and people would be able to understand it. Now we ask, the question is, how many people would be able to take a sentence that's a whole page long and be able to handle that today? The evolutionary model is completely incapable of explaining the origin of human language. Acheulean hand axe was an index tool to identify Homo erectus. And if you ever found this, it had to be because of Homo erectus. Now it's been found with Homo sapiens fossils. Was used worldwide, northern Europe to southern Africa, and from the Mediterranean to India and Indonesia. From a few inches to over a foot long, flat like a giant almond, pointed and thinner at one end, round and thicker at the other, with an eccentric center of gravity, with a cutting edge all around its perimeter. Therefore, it was no chopping tool because you'd end up with your hand being just as chopped. Or there was no handle, there was no haft rather, that was to be attached. How could you attach it to something that's sharp all the way around? Some were crude and others were works of art. So what was it used for? Well, finally one person came up, Eileen O'Brien. Actually, it's a flying projectile weapon, thrown discus style. When thrown, it spun horizontally as it rose, like a discus. At a maximum altitude, it flipped on its edge and descended. It landed 93% on its knife-sharp edge, 70% point first. The average throw was over 30 meters, 100 feet, and accurate to within 2 yards, right or left on the line of trajectory. The Olympic discus records well over 60 meters, which is 200 feet. Therefore, ancient humans could have attacked large animals perhaps 200 feet away with great accuracy. What?
10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Technology, state of evolution. The mistake of evolutionary archaeologists is to equate simple with primitive. Almost every basic style of tool has been found with almost every category of human fossil. Stringer and Grun, the simplistic equation of hominids and technologies in Europe has thus been abandoned. Lawrence Robbins. These oldest of technological items, primitive Oldowon tools, are among the most successful inventions, for they continue to be manufactured throughout the entire Stone Age. Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. You think of obsidian scalpels by modern surgeons. That the obsidian scalpels were being tested because they had a sharper point and they kept that sharper edge than even steel did. I'm not quite sure where. I think there was a problem with the sterilization. But the thing is that yes, even stone tools now can have a great deal of value. Many instances of ancient people's technical knowledge lost in later generations. The Göbekli Tepe, the early stone circles are the most advanced. With the best craftsmanship, later circles get progressively smaller, less well crafted. Were they losing the technology, losing interest, or losing the skill? Egypt's earliest mummies were the most impressive, but the quality of mummification drops off as the mummies get younger. The pyramids, Stonehenge, Easter Island, many other monoliths all over the world, but the knowledge required for making, finishing, transporting, and erecting them has been lost. Pyramids. You cannot put a piece of paper between the blocks. How do you get huge, tons large blocks to have that close a connection, a butting to each other? You have the burning of the Alexandria Library, supposedly by accident, by Julius Caesar, I think it was. Anyway, again, you have how much knowledge has been lost? How much knowledge has never been regained? Technology, primitive. Mankind has been the only observer of science there ever was, able to think abstractly with brain power equal to a civilized counterpart. Aristarchus' heliocentric theory was overruled by the scientists of the day for Ptolemy's geocentric theory. Eratosthenes of Alexandria calculated the Earth's circumference at 24,662 miles, 70 miles off from the actual, but scientists of Columbus Day figured 12,000. Darwin's theory of natural selection was operating in man. Then the most primitive peoples in Asia, Africa, and Oceania would not have survived under the competitive impact of Western culture. Yet, the sons of the so-called African savages are studying at Harvard and Oxford. Asian natives are receiving the Nobel Prize for mathematics. So, if you think of all of this, all of these things, you can take a look at yourself, and the absolute technical skills that were being in evidence, so that you could pick up a stone anywhere and be able to come up with a point in which you could kill game with. You didn't have to carry them with you. You didn't have to go and buy them. You didn't have to go into metallurgy. You could just pick up what you needed right there. Jewish historian Josephus, Cain invented a system of weights and measures. Godly descendants of Seth studied the movements of the heavenly bodies. Oklo, Gabon, Africa. 16 self-sustaining nuclear reactors, human-initiated or very lucky natural happenstance. There's a lot out there that is not going to be explained easily by evolution. Other humanoids, and this you can take a look at yourself, the different kinds of, first of all, you have a humanoid that's being built on the basis of a tooth or a skull, whatever. You can take a look at that yourself. God created men. God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule. So God created the man in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Image. What does God mean by image? What is an image? Well, here you have a picture of images of someone that we love. God created man in his own image. Someone that creation yearns to see. We are to make God recognizable. In other words, creation, because we are the bearers of the image of God, creation looks to us to get an idea of what God is all about. Or they should be able to. Unfortunately, because of the fall, it doesn't happen. But the idea that God created us specifically for a most extraordinary, important role in the universe. So from the image we get to the likeness. And again, God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule. So God created the man in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. The word for likeness is kind of a special word. As you get into the Hebrew, the word for blood is dam. And Madam is the man of blood, if you will, or all humanity, is Adam. And he was made from the Adamah, which is the soil, the red or blood soil. But he was made in the Dhamma, the blood likeness of God. Now, why is this perhaps so important or special? Because God himself identified what the blood was all about in terms of understanding. For the life soul of the flesh is the blood. The blood is the life of the soul. In other words, the blood somehow was more than just merely symbolic. It is somehow the connection to the very soul, core being, if you will, of someone. Mankind is in the image or the soul of God. Holy Communion, the life, soul, blood of Jesus, through which we are returned closer to the likeness of God, comes because we have his blood. We are invited to drink of him. In one sip, you have the very core of God that enters into you and me. How does this understand, or anything else like this, we don't understand. But the apparentness of the Bible is to emphasize the fact that this connection with God to the very core of his being goes all the way back from the very first chapter of the Bible and goes throughout the whole Bible to the last chapter. But Jesus is praised as the Lamb who shed his blood. Now, the context of male and female for the human is identified here. God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them." And then when you get to chapter 5, it's repeated. God created man, he made him in the likeness of God, male and female he created them. And then when you take a look at Genesis 2, you actually have two separate creation accounts, one for the male and one for the female, with stated purpose. Now the question I have is that why is there such an emphasis on male and female? One would assume that of course, if you're going to have any kind of procreation, you're going to have the two. And it's not mentioned at all in regard to the animals until you finally get to the ark, when they had to make sure that male and female of each species is brought on. So why is there such strong emphasis, and why do you have an emphasis on the separate creation of both man and woman? The world assumes that male and female are only for the reason of procreation. Therefore, all relationships are defined in sexual function terms. But for the human, gender is directly linked to the image and likeness of God. Therefore, masculine and feminine hinge not on cultural ideas, but as defined by God's expression of himself. There is a very important role that a man and a woman have in terms of masculinity and femininity, in which God is being described by his choice. That there are essences, or there's emphases that are being drawn out by both, and you need both to have the balanced view of God. It's what I call the binocular vision of God. With one eye can work very, very well. There are many people who operate their whole life without having to worry about second eye because they've lost it either by disease or accident or whatever. And they can drive and do all kinds of things. But why do we have two? Why did God want us to have two eyes? And the reason why is because two eyes gives you depth. It gives you 3 dimensions. It gives you the ability to see things you can't do with just only one eye. Binocular view of God, the depth and the fullness of particularly his heart being expressed in the male and the female. What is the creator of the universe telling the cosmos about himself through your gender? That's the question that we, if we're going to hold on to the Bible, need to be confronted with. That God is saying something to the world, to the universe, about himself through the masculine or the feminine that you are. At the center for the reason of the universe's existence. To understand the beginning, we have to start in the middle. This is the visited planet, not a mere theory, but an account. Jehovah is personally involved with the affairs of the earth. The Creator has actually put foot on this earth. You have the picture of the kissing the face of God, which is really kind of a neat picture. The Almighty God has counted your life more valuable than his own. The Maker of this universe and more has died for you. All creation is affected by the death of Jesus because this is its Creator. This is not something that has happened in a small little corner of the universe, but the Creator lived here. The Creator died here. The Creator rose from the dead. So to understand the beginning, to go back into Genesis, means you have to start in the middle when you take a look at Jesus and identify there what God is saying about humanity, about this little pebble in the vastness of the universe, when the Creator himself has given such dignity to who and what we are. We are not just dealing with Genesis 1 and 2. We are dealing with what his story, the history of God's involvement is about. We are at a center for the reason why the universe exists. That's who mankind is. Not a mere byproduct of chance, but the dignity of a God that said, I need you. I want you to be my image before the universe. I want you to represent my heart, to have the likeness of God in you. And I need both men and women to be men and women in order for that picture, for that image, for that likeness to fully be expressed in this universe. Nothing I say can explain to you divine love, yet all of creation cannot seem to stop talking about God. To follow the occult, the cults, the world's religions, the world's philosophies requires you to give up some understanding, assurance, comfort, or faith. If you are going to follow them, you will be losing something. For something of no value in return for the things God has done, and is doing. And will do for you when he comes back again and takes you. What do you want to give up? If you want to follow the concept of evolution and make that primary importance by which you're going to now define the Bible, you will give up something. What is it that you are giving up? You cannot go away from the Bible without something getting lost. Choose wisely. Thank you for your time. BC, the Bible is a tough book. I mean, what could be worse than the fall of Adam and Eve? And then you have the winter of Adam and Eve. Folks in the church are always coming to me with their problems, and I do my best to give them sound advice. But when a problem is too big for me, I turn to the one who is the source of all wisdom and fount of all knowledge, dear Ann Landers. What are you guys doing? Anyway, discover a treasure trove of books. Books? What's this one? That's a Bible. Proverbs 21. It is better to live in the desert than with a contentious and fretful woman. As she throws it away, have you got any other books? The end. How did your date with him go last night? I wasn't all that keen on the ending. What was wrong with the ending? It was too far away from the beginning. Hopefully that's not quite your opinion of our course. Thank you for your indulgence, and I hope that you learn as much as I learned doing this course. Good night.